Is Russia still winning? As the Russo-Ukrainian conflict has progressed into what appears to be its tide-turning phase, it has become increasingly difficult to determine who has maintained the upper hand. One side will tell you that Ukraine's endurance over these several weeks and the retreating of Russian forces from the north of the country indicate that Ukraine is winning. Inversely, the other side will point to Russia's continued holdover and consolidation of a great swath of the southeast as a victory already extracted, as this gives Russia a direct land bridge to previously annexed Crimea and places it in a prime position to invade further westward and finally cut Ukraine off from the sea. Numerically, both sides have suffered significant losses, with Ukraine having suffered some 4,000 military fatalities, while Russia's armed forces have suffered a loss of some 2,000. Ukraine has claimed the figure of some 10,000 of their soldiers having been wounded, while Russia claims about 4,000 of their own soldiers having been wounded, an additional 2,000 fatalities having been reported by the pro-Russian breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia's total active personnel numbers at some 850,000, with some 200,000 deployed in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk providing some 20,000 and 14,000 personnel respectively. Ukraine also has some 200,000 personnel deployed, however this constitutes the entirety of their active personnel. Both Russia and Ukraine also have some 250,000 personnel in reserve, though given the tremendous active personnel disparity, Ukraine would easily exhaust the reserves before Russia even needs to resort to using their own. Supposedly, Ukraine has expanded the reserve to some 900,000, but the training and abilities of these new reserve forces are questionable. Both sides have also seen to employing the use of paramilitary forces, Ukraine drawing upon some 100,000, while Russia has 250,000 at the ready. With the exclusion of Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia's armed forces have sustained significantly fewer injuries and fatalities than Ukraine, both in raw numbers and as a proportion of their total manpower. As far as mobilization goes, there is little that Ukraine can do, and by this point, the turning of the tides even slightly would depend heavily upon Western support, which it is in the process of receiving. A common mistake is to observe the conflict with Western strategy in mind. Russia has long realized it cannot compete with the West militarily if it opts to emulate Western strategy. That is, the utilization of a highly interconnected international supply chain, the utilization of expensive but highly advanced weaponry, and utilization of air power as the prime means of striking an enemy, with ground forces merely providing an occupational function or at most providing supplemental support. Russia produces an abundance of inexpensive but powerful equipment very suitable for a geographically large country with a high population. If Russian trucks, tanks, or planes are destroyed in combat, the blow is not as significant as it would be to a more technologically advanced and more expensive Western asset. Russia's equipment is by its very design meant to be easily replaceable and used in great number. Russia also treats its air force as a minor player on the battlefield, opting instead to dominate in land power, something which especially suits its geographical aims of maintaining order and dominance in its Eurasian neighborhood. Russia has invested in building its artillery and missile capabilities so as to strike enemy targets from afar and counter enemy air forces from the ground. Furthermore, for years since Russia has come to terms with the fact that it could not join the global order established by the West without significantly compromising on its own interests, and which it had been eager to participate in following the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Republic has moved away from international dependencies and toward a policy of autarky or self-sufficiency. While Russia is not as wealthy as its Western contemporaries, it has built a more stable and localized supply chain, which, when shaken, can be largely restabilized from within or through clever brokering of Russian resources with other nations dependent upon them. This is most clear to see in the fact that despite immense sanctioning, ostracism from the international community, and of course the war on its border, Russia's economy is returning to a state of relative normalcy considering the impact of the war, and the ruble after a brief decline has rebounded, demonstrating that Russia is capable of pushing back against the global West's economic retaliation. As it stands, Ukraine is essentially on life support provided by the West at no expense, except of course the continuation of the war. Putin has made very clear a determination to not back down from the southeast, and the fact that the idea of expanding further is still well on the table should convey that Russia is not in a particularly vulnerable position. While the retreat from the north certainly appeared to many as a show of Russian weakness, it must also not be forgotten that this front could have easily been a half-hearted effort at toppling the capital and ending the conflict early, with the prime purpose behind it being to actually divert attention away from the southeast. That is, Russia might have attacked Kiev with only the intention to distract Ukraine, but would have captured it if resistance wasn't as intense. An assault on the capital also helps Russia to gauge just how intensely Ukraine will defend territory where Ukrainians constitute an absolute majority and where there is major political and historic meaning. In essence, if Ukraine were to show Russia the absolute most fight it could put up, it would be in defense of the capital. And Russia can now use that knowledge to better strategize its invasion, which will now likely focus on regions with a larger population of ethnic Russians and where Russia has a better strategic advantage. Phase 2 of the war will likely entail Russia cutting Ukraine off from the sea and further consolidating its domination of the south. Because Ukraine joining NATO following this conflict is virtually assured, I do not believe Russia will settle for taking a small prize now and following up on conquering what it wants from Ukraine later. And what it wants, as I've said before, is the security of a natural border against a Western protrusion into its heartland. Phase 3 of the war, if Russia is able to effectively weaken Ukraine and further discourage Western involvement, will see a Russian push to the Dnieper River, but leave a landlocked northwestern Ukraine independent, as Russia no doubt recognizes that it would be unable to hold such territory. Russia has demonstrated a great deal of confidence thus far. From the very beginning, launching an invasion that would have surely left it ostracized from the global community, Russia is going all or nothing in this conflict, and past the fog of war, unless there is a truly massive degree of mismanagement on Russia's side, it is likely the conflict is still moving in Russia's favor, and the only thing that could change that is of course an increased level of involvement from the Western powers. There is a possibility, albeit a grim one, that the West recognizes Russia's refusal to back down and secretly believes Ukraine doesn't stand a chance. However, the fear of Russia emerging from this conflict stronger than before is too great of a threat to allow. And so despite the odds against Ukraine, Russian losses are exaggerated and Western supplies to Ukraine continue to flood in only for the purpose of perpetuating the war and destabilizing both countries. This would be one of the darkest possibilities, but if it were true, then the West would essentially be using Ukraine as a sacrificial lamb to cripple Russia, knowing that the Ukrainians would not stop fighting for their homeland if they felt they had a chance, but also knowing that Russia was capable of continuing the war for months or years. Thus the insistence on supplying Ukraine for as long as the conflict continues, and the need to allocate an additional $33 billion to the conflict from the US alone. Something that wouldn't be necessary if Russia's defeat on account of poor leadership and logistics was truly inevitable. That, of course, is just heavy speculation, so do take it with a grain of salt. And with that said, like the video if you enjoyed it, and tune in next week for more. Mr. Z, out.